Hello dear learners, let me continue the discussion on public service motivation. In the previous session, I have talked about the meaning of public service motivation. Various motives I've discussed depending upon the contribution of Perry and Weiss. We talked about rational motives, norm-based motives and affective-based motives, and also looked into the construct of public service motivation to tell the levels of public service motivation, to check the levels of public service motivations among people, and depending upon the levels of the scores, we can see that whether the people will have inclination towards joining the public service, or what about the performance and the related aspects to it. In this session, I will focus on application of public service motivations in terms of strategies, building on the work of Palberg, Perry, and Herdingham in the research work titled "From Theory to Practice: Strategies for Applying Public Service Motivation." In the title "Motivation in Public Management: The Call of Public Service," right? So this particular discussion is based on the research work of Palberg and colleagues. Let us look into in terms of understanding how public service motivation can be applied into the organizations, and so that there is a culture in which people will excel to perform according to the value systems and the leadership which aligns much more with the context of public service, in terms of interest as well as motivated behaviors, right? So, according to Palberg and colleagues, different strategies and tactics they have talked about at different levels in the organization, and they talked about how PSM can be applied with the various functions in the organizations to create a culture where people excel and perform really well, right? So, let us look into this application one by one. First of all, in terms of strategy, the authors talked about integrating PSM into the human resource management function. So, as you know, human resource management is a function which takes care of the management of people in the organization in terms of recruiting people, selecting, putting them into training and development track, career management track, their compensation, performance appraisal, and related things. So the authors talked about how PSM can be integrated into the human resource management functions, and they talked about some of the examples to how to integrate that particular the aspect of PSM into HRM function. So let us, if we look at the concept of selection for that matter in terms of HRM function, so one can possibly include the criteria of public service motivation among people as one of the criteria to select people, right? So that is one way of integrating the public service motivation into the function of HRM. Also, especially about training and development also can be planned around that particular aspect. Performance appraisal for that matter can also have the performance indicators in terms of public service motivation contribution, and so that the PSM is integrated in terms of application to the HRM function, because in public sector organizations, if you look at these kind of these strategies and these kind of the tactics will help in creating the culture for the organization, right? And the second thing what can be done is creation of meaningful and purposeful jobs, right? So you'll say, the author says that we have to focus on the jobs in such a way which create meaning for people, right? For example, we talked about the aspect of compassion or civic duty in the construct of public service motivation as given by Perry. So think of the ways in which how would you actually infuse people with that kind of energy, so that they are much more inclined to do work because they consider their jobs to be really meaningful and purposeful in terms of bringing change in the lives of the people, right? So we have seen it in in the case of the IS officers Armstrong Palme. So that condition, if these kind of people are in the jobs and they were given this kind of job environment and the job design, they will be doing really well in terms of their job because they find a lot of meaning and purpose in their job, right? So because their motive is to fulfill the aspects of welfare for the community and doing well for the community and so on and so forth, right? Then in terms of work environment, you create work environment which supports public service motivation. So how would you do that? In terms of, I've just talked about that you create the the performance management system in such a way where the aspects of public service motivations are actually one of the performance indicators, the outcomes attached to people's efforts in the organization, right? So if they know that their public service motivation in terms of their efforts are well acknowledged or they are appreciated, then of course you will say that you will see these kind of behaviors much more in the people there, right? So ultimately the idea is to encourage, right, encourage the idea of public service motivation. You want people to show these kind of behaviors because they are into public service, they should show. So you have to create the kind of environment where people would like to contribute, they would continue to sustain efforts in terms of public interest and so forth. So how will you create that kind of environment? Your incentives should focus on that, right? So do you design also incentive in such a way that it's not leading to much more of extrinsic motivation? So design incentive in such a way that the jobs themselves will give a lot of meaning and the environment is such that it gives a lot of meaning to people to contribute in that particular work environment, right? Then at an organizational level, if you look at how PSM integration can be done, it's about linking the idea or values of public service motivation with the mission of the organization. And you see, mission we have talked about in terms of official goals. If you remember our discussion on goals of the organization. So missions are basically official goals of the organization which actually tell the community and the organizational members that what is that organization want to achieve, what is the organization's reason for existence for that matter. So if you integrate your public service motivation value into your mission or your strategy or the kind of leadership, it actually create a lot of difference in terms of, because people will then understand that this is something which the organization is serious about. They will continue to put in efforts to derive that particular change which is required for public service motivation. So much focus on value based leadership, value based leadership in terms of public service motivation. Try to write your mission statements or the vision statements which actually talks about the public service motivation as an important value in that sense, right? So focus on integrating the PSM into the mission, strategy and leadership of the organization, right? At the society level, what you can do is when you communicate with the society outside, as society at large, you actually have to convince, or I will say rather you gain that kind of legitimacy from the society that your organization is actually good in terms of doing activities for the public service. So what you can do is you can actually make use of your social media, you can make use of the electronic media or mass media to actually tell people about your goals, about your motives towards the public service. And also you can collaborate, as the paper mentioned, you can collaborate with the different societal institutions, perhaps the non-government organizations who are working at the grassroots level to perform, to promote your public service motivation. So in a way, the idea is that you have to convince the people within and outside the organization that you are valuing, you are actually giving much more importance to public service motivation, and somehow you have to show that in terms of your actions by integrating into the various functions, creation of meaningful jobs, creation of the work environment that supports public service motivation. I talk about vision, strategy and leadership which is inclined towards the public service motivation, and finally try to also see how you connect with the society and try to gain legitimacy in terms of that your organization stands by the public service, society interest and the welfare of the community. So this is about the application of public service motivation into the organizations, especially in the public sector organizations, right? Let's look into, take a case study. This basically is the research work by Sirez and Farinella. titled Public Service Motivation, how does it relate to management reforms and changes in the working situations of public organization, a case study of Italian Revenue Agency published in Public Policy and Administration. So this case study is about employees at the Italian Revenue Agency, and the idea is to explore the relationship between public service motivation and perception of change. Let's look into this particular research study, and I'll discuss about the findings of the paper with all of you, because lot of work like this is being done, especially in the public sector organization, that what is there with the public service motivation, and what are the important outcomes of these application of public service motivation into the organization, or how it is being understood with different variables in the context of public service motivation. Now, the study aims, this particular study is focused on to investigate if public service motivation is an inherent trait, or if it evolves as a responses to the change in the workplace environment. So the idea here is to check whether public service motivation is there in people, or this particular aspect evolve when people start working with the organization, right? A lot of research work, also recent works also started talking about, can somebody be trained on public service motivation after giving them the training, can it happen? So these kind of things are also been discussed in the literature. Now, focus on this particular study focus on employees of the Italian Revenue Agency, with implication for understanding how PSM interacts with organizational changes. So, what are the key questions? Key questions are, does a positive perception of changes in the workplace enhance public service motivation, and also does high public service motivation make employees more receptive to workplace changes? So, what is the true? Is it perception of changes in workplace enhance PSM, or PSM make people more receptive to workplace changes, right? Now, before going to the the findings of the study, what they have done is they have measured the public service motivation by including dimensions such as politics, public interest, altruism, and bureaucratic governance, addressing specific issues of collective well-being, and so on and so forth. So, four major dimensions that they have considered for public service motivation are politics, public interest, altruism, and bureaucratic governance. So, let us see what are the findings of this research study. So, the first finding is related to the relationship between public service motivation and perception of change. The study in particular found that the positive perception of workplace change, it primarily affects the bureaucratic governance dimension of public service motivation, right? So, the positive perception of workplace change primarily affects the bureaucratic governance dimension of the PSM. That only dimension they have could found for relationship between PSM and perception of change is about the bureaucratic governance. Right. Next is employees who perceive organizational changes positively, they tend to show a stronger sense of duty and commitment to the public service ethos, right? So, in terms of perception of change, it has been found that people who have a positive perception, they have stronger sense of duty and commitment to the public service ethos, right? Now, impact of PSM on job outcomes. If there is a PSM, a public service motivation, what is the impact this motivation has on the job outcomes among people, right? Now, it says that as well as bureaucratic governance, dimension is concerned, employees with high level of PSM on this dimension and view organizational, and viewing organizational change are strongly associated with higher level of job satisfaction. This is another finding of the study. Then in terms of involvement and motivation, they say that high public service motivation levels, especially in the dimension of public interest and altruism, they also positively impact the work motivation. Positively impact the work motivation. So you see that application of PSM is really having some important outcomes for the individuals as well as the organizations in terms of impacting the important performance related indicators. Then finally, the key findings on organizational commitment. So the people high on PSM in terms of bureaucratic governance are more likely to exhibit organizational commitment, and positive change in the work environment, as the author mentioned, further enhances it, right? So concluding this particular research study, we can say that from the findings of the study, that PSM can evolve in response to the positive changes in the workplace, especially when these changes align with the public service value, right? Also, important work related outcomes such as job satisfaction, motivation and commitment, and all are associated with the higher level of public service motivation and positive perception of change. So we talked about this, job satisfaction, motivation, commitment. All these are the important work related factors that we are now going to discuss in connection to public service motivation, right? Because these are important work related attitudes, right? And these are important for the important performance outcomes for the organization. Let's look into these work related attitudes quickly one by one. First one is job satisfaction. It's a very important work related attitude. So the job satisfaction has been defined in a number of ways in the literature. In the simple terms, as per the definition of Locke, it has been defined as a pleasurable or positive emotional state resulting from the appraisals of one's job or job experiences. So when you are working in the organizations, you are working in the job, what are your feelings about your job? If you are saying you are job satisfied, so you will say that your feelings are more of a positive emotional state, which is directly linked to your job environment, kind of job experiences that you are having, right? Now, research also says that there are multiple conceptualizations, multiple, the definitions are there, but there is no agreement on the general meaning of the job satisfaction, right? On the other hand, if you look at what kind of factors impact the job satisfaction, a large number of factors has been studied in the literature, right? For example, human resource management practices linking to job satisfaction, leadership, linking to job satisfaction, working conditions, somebody's career growth is linked to this thing, right? Somebody given autonomy, somebody's perception of the practices of the or working condition in the organization. All these factors are related to the aspect of job satisfaction, but generalization that what factors lead to job satisfaction in different contexts are going to be different. For example, what motivates people in the private sector organization in terms of job satisfaction or in the public sector organization. So this is the kind of generalizations which are often difficult to make. So these generalizations are difficult because of the various reasons we talked about earlier also. People working in different job contexts, people coming with different experiences, individuals are different, their preference for things are different. That's why the generalizations are largely difficult in that way, right? But let's look into the aspect of which is very important in terms of creating jobs for the organizational people. Especially in terms of the public sector organization, it has a lot of value, is the model of Hackman and Oldham on motivation through the design of work, test of the theory, published in Organizational Behavior and Human Resources, right? Let's quickly go into this. So job characteristic theory talks about that there are some core job dimensions such as skill variety, task identity and task significance. Skill variety is meaning that how much your job is allowed you to use a variety of skills in the job. So if your jobs allows you or is required that you use multiple skills in your job, what will happen? You will experience meaningfulness in the job, right? On the other hand, if your job doesn't allow you to, doesn't require variety in the skills, so you will have lesser meaningfulness in your job. Example, now in case of the public sector organization, where you have to have variety of skills, you are talking to multiple stakeholders, you are negotiating with people, you are building relationships, you are talking to the people outside, you are building relationship with the political authority. So you are requiring multiple skill set, to take care of their job. You also have to be technical competent to take care of your area. So you see huge variety in the job it will happen, it will lead to the experience of meaningfulness in the work. Also, if your tasks are highly identified, people can recognize that this piece of work is being completed by someone, and people recognize that you are the one who are doing these jobs there, right? So high task identity, and how much value, how much significance is being attached to that particular the work that you are doing. So all these things, core job dimensions, is leading to the aspect of experienced meaningfulness for the work, which is a psychological state that you people will experience when you have these kind of core job dimensions, and you have high skill variety, tasks are highly identified, and tasks are also significant, right? Then is how much autonomy is being given to you to complete your work. How will you plan your work? A complete freedom is given to you. If this is the case, you will also experience responsibility of the work outcomes, right? So that's another important motivation and job satisfaction thing that you will derive from the autonomy that is given to you for your job. Then is the feedback. Knowledge of your actual results of the work activities. That's another critical psychological state that you will talk about. Now, why job satisfaction is an important work attitude? Because it will also lead to the performance. So people, if you are more job satisfied, right, they will then channelize their efforts better in terms of enhancing their performance. So idea here is to create situations or create environment in such a way, create jobs in such a way where people will experience these critical psychological state of meaningfulness, responsibility, and knowledge of actual results, so that they can enhance their performance. But research also says that the linkages between job satisfaction and performance sometimes have mixed evidence from the literature. Some people says that job satisfaction links to performance, others they have reported a different kind of a finding, right? Let's look into some of the examples of papers here. Among Indian healthcare workers, it has been found that public sector healthcare workers reported good employment benefits and recognition by superior at work as important factors with respect to motivation, right? So this is the if you look at the paper number 1 by Peters, Chakrabarti, Mahapatra, and Steinhardt. So they reported that good employment benefits and recognition by superior at work were important factors with respect to motivation and the job satisfaction amongst the public healthcare employees. Also, job characteristics and job satisfaction, they were found to be positive relationship among employees working in the public health sector. Refer to the paper of Rai and Maheshwari, where have they talked about how job characteristics are impacting the job satisfaction. This is what we have discussed. Job characteristics, if are there, how it leads to the satisfaction. So research also says that within Indian public sector bank, it was found that job characteristics, core job dimensions leads to the higher level of job satisfaction. But as we have already mentioned, that the broad generalization would be difficult, so we have to go by the contextual analysis also, as far as the the public sector as well as private sector organizations are concerned, right? Next, the important attitude is the commitment, organizational commitment. And as Maude, Stairs, and Porter, they define commitment is the relative strength of an individual's identification with and involvement in a particular organization. So how much you are identified with an organization and how much you are involved in an organization. So to go by further about how they have defined this is basically when you are involved and you are individually identified with the organization, how would you behave? You have a strong belief in what you say, that the values and the organizational goals you accept them, right? Second, you are also ready to put in efforts on behalf of your organizations, because you are identified with the organization and you want to continue to maintain your membership with that particular organization. So these are the important factors which relates to the commitment definition proposed by Maude, Stairs, and Porter. Now, what is the difference, do you think, between job satisfaction and commitment? So, when we talk about job satisfaction, it is more related with the aspect of the job that you are doing, right? On the other hand, organizational commitment has a broader scope in terms of your commitment towards the overall organization's mission, their goals, their values, right? And you want to continue your membership, right? Mayer and Ellen also has extensively worked in the area of organizational commitment, and they have defined commitment by taking three components in this thing. So what are the three important components they take? Affective commitment, continuous commitment, and normative commitment. So when we talk about the affective commitment, as the name indicates, affection is that you as a person are emotionally attached to the organization, you are emotionally identified, and you are emotionally involved in the organization, right? Continuous commitment, on the other hand, is basically, as the name indicates, to maintain continuity. So if you feel that if you have to leave this organization, what is the cost that you have to pay for that leaving? So you continue, you look at the cost attached to when you are thinking of leaving that particular organization, as per Madan and Iyer. Normative commitment is basically, it's an obligation. You are working with the organization, so you have an obligation that you wanted to continue your employment with your organization. That's what is the component of normative commitment. Now, another model which is much more prevalent in the context of the public sector organization is the model given by Balfour and Wechsler. Organizational commitment and antecedent and outcomes in the public organizations, published in Public Productivity and Management Review. So according to them, three different forms of commitment in the public sector organizations are identification commitment, affiliation commitment, and exchange commitment, which is different from what Allen and Meyer has proposed in terms of affective commitment, continuous, and normative commitment. Let's look into what they say. That when it is identification commitment, it's basically employees having that kind of experience, and they feel that they are working with an organization, and they get a lot of pride in that, right? And they feel that their organization is doing very good, is doing good work, welfare. So something that is basically it's a good cause. So that is basically identification commitment, and you yourself also very closely identified as a person with that that identification of the organization. Affiliation means that you belong to that particular institution, you are one of that organization, one of the part of that organization, and you want to very closely relate to the other members of the organization. Then is the exchange commitment. It is basically a belief in terms of when you put in efforts, what you get in the return in terms of your accomplishment. That's another important way of looking at the commitment in the organizational literature as far as public sector organizations are concerned, right? Now, if you look at the research inside, some of the research reported higher level of commitment levels, and others found no difference in terms of public and private sector organization. The references you can look at here. Low levels of commitment reported among employees of public sector organization because of low clarity, autonomy, and challenge in jobs. That's another finding. Also, if you look at the factor which can help enhance the commitment and managers should focus on, they are to do with involve your people in decision making, so that they feel committed towards their job activities. Provide the lot of respect, support, in terms of being a supervisor, you need to provide them support, and of course very important is providing them the opportunity for advancement. So these are some of the things which you can do in terms of increasing somebody's commitment within the organization, right? Then comes the employee engagement as important work related attitude. This relates to the aspects of as Rene mentioned, that employee engagement, the focus of this particular aspect is on recent public management reforms, that they want people to be much more engaged in their work. And how Kahan define work engagement is about harnessing oneself to work by becoming fully invested physically, emotionally and cognitively in the task, right? And then Shoffley and Becker, Salanova, Gonzalez, Roma and Becker, they have also defined employee engagement consisting of various dimensions in terms of vigor, dedication and absorption. Now, according to the authors, they say that vigor is to do with somebody's energy for the work, willingness, energy and the resilience to put in efforts for the work. Dedication, on the other hand, is about your enthusiasm, inspiration and pride. Absorption is about how much you are engrossed or how much you are concentrated in your work that you feel completely detached from the other thoughts and activities. That's how they are talking about the absorption. So if employees are engaged in their work, what can be expected? High level of performance, and it also, research says that it relates positively to job satisfaction and commitment. And when people are engaged, they have lesser turnover intention. They don't want to move to the other the organizations to move on, right? Let's quickly look into some of the research insights with respect to employee engagement. As per the Deloitte study by Agarwal et al., they say that employee engagement can lead to higher level of public trust, because public will feel that people are doing their job really well, they are engaged in their work, right? So it basically what means that when there is increased employee engagement, citizens' experience of public service, experience of public service delivery by these people is much more, because these people are much more engaged in their work. So hence the public trust will also increase. Also, the perception of justice, so especially distribution and distributive and interactional justice, they are important determinants of job engagement, especially in the Indian public sector bank, if you refer to the paper number 1 mentioned here. Also, there are important role played by the HR practices, such as security in the employment, involvement in the decision making, training, career opportunities. All these factors of HR practices which organizations, especially the public sector organization, can look into in order to enhance job satisfaction and employee engagement among employees of the public sector undertakings, right? So with this, I am going to conclude this session. We will continue the discussion on other important work related attitudes in the next session.